As always, our show is sponsored by Memoria Press. You can find our curriculum at memoriapress.com.
Welcome to Classical Etc., a show from Memoria Press that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
Welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. On today's episode, we're talking about the article from the winter 2023 edition of The Classical Teacher by Martin Cothran called The Culmination of the Classical Hero. Now, Martin,
I noticed you called it the article.
Oh,
capital
please.
T, the article. Now, Martin, am I correct that this article is run in the catalog a number of times?
This
Or
has
is it
never
just-
been run
No, it's new.
brand new.
Isn't this very similar to the Christmas article you ran in 20?
There were I used
20?
part of the same one of the debates that I refer to in here between G.K. Chesterton and Robert Blatchford, the British newspaperman. I referenced in there, so that's probably what you're thinking.
I was thinking that all of your articles are just different stories that are telling the same story.
It's the mono article.
It's the mono article. Now, before we get into discussing the mono article, I did want to ask you all a question. What are you reading right now? Paul, you been reading anything interesting of late?
I just finished Andy Catlett.
Oh.
Oh, really?
I did.
No,
yes.
isn't Andy Catlett who Wendellberry says is kind of himself?
Well, Wendellberry doesn't say that,
oh,
but
that's what other people say
He's
about
one
him.
of
Yes.
the characters. that
Yes.
Okay.
is Wendell. Yeah.
Okay.
yes.
What do you
which
think
is
of
very
it?
nice. I thought that book was as I was finishing it, I realized because I thought it was going to be more about Andy's adulthood because that's what most of his books are, is somebody's adult experience, and it's not. It's his experience as a kid.
Mm.
And I thought this is, and he might get mad at me for saying this, but I felt like it was a coming of age novel that is extremely different from any other coming of age novel because he's learning to be an adult. It's not just him goofing off and getting in troubles sort of thing, and then realizing, there may be something better, but it's the community teaching him what it means to be a man. And I loved that whole aspect of it.
Yeah. Have you both read Andy Catlett?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he's Andy Catlett is Wendellberry, the author, and so is Jayber Crow, I would say.
Jayber Crow is the one he told me that he had been waiting years to write. Like it was inside of him for a long, long time before he wrote it. Andy Catlett, he wrote after he wrote so many adult stories about Andy. And then he went back. Andy Catlett is one of the newer. I think Dave typed that one, not me.
I've read it. Mark, what are you reading recently?
Well, I just now I'm still I'm about to finish The Life of Greece by Will Durant, which I've been reading for a little while. I'm really greatly enjoying. Will Durant is a really, really great writer, and his ability to amass all of this historical information and put it into this very literate, very scholarly work, but just a joy to read. It's just amazing. I've also started The Three Musketeers.
No.
I was going to read that, and Paul told me it wasn't very good.
No, that is not what I intended to convey. I believe what I said was if you were expecting the same caliber of work as the Count of Monte Cristo from Dumas, you're not going to get it.
I don't
I'm
know. I
reading
put it back on the
anyway.
shelf.
I'm reading it.
Okay.
Anyway.
It's a great book. I mean, just enjoyable book. I just don't think
Just
it rises to the same level.
And
I
then
do think
I'm not finished yet now.
I think at some point, as a bit on the show, we should decide which of the Musketeers the three of you are.
Who are you, D'Artagnan?
I'm obviously D'Artagnan. Yeah, that was my point.
Is that the hero?
Well, he's the younger
I'm just
one
at
who's
the beginning of the
coming on
story.
with the
D'Artagnan's
rest.
kind of flaky right now. And then for my just fun book, I just finished Sackett in the Sackett cycle.
The Louis L'Amour?
Louis L'Amour.
Yeah.
And started Mojave Crossing, which is the next one in the Sackett series, which I just think Louis L'Amour is fabulous.
Yeah. Nadia, you just completed a pretty grueling, but I'm sure it was very life-giving trip to the West Coast.
Yes.
Did you find time to read while you were traipsing around Los Angeles?
But I chose to take with me a 700-page book, which was a mistake because I'm hauling around this huge book. I'm reading The Winners by Frederick Bachman, which is I have to read so that your wife and I can discuss it.
Okay.
So I've read everything that he wrote. And this is I don't know why he wrote such a huge book this time, but I am enjoying it. And I did have a little time to read, but not a lot.
Yeah.
And that's all I took with
This is
me.
someone I've never heard of.
Oh, his books are so good. There's a movie out now with Tom Hanks called A Man Called Otto that's based on his book, A Man Called Ove. However you say OVE.
Okay.
He
what did
wrote
you say
that.
the name of the author was?
Frederick Bachman.
Okay.
It may
I've
be
heard of that book. I've heard of that
Bachman.
book.
It may be Bachman. I don't really know how to pronounce it. I do know how to pronounce Brian Jake, though.
And I wondered if that.
Thank you for that.
Brian Jake.
It's not Jacques.
No.
Okay.
If you're just listening to this and not watching, I just hit Martin, so it's probably worth watching.
And it's not the first time.
My wife has also read everything.
Yes. We're going to have a great. You're going to babysit Jack, and we're going to meet together and talk about
that
it.
Sounds like a
Or
great
Jack
time.
can come with us.
Yeah, that would be great too, but maybe better. So recently I've been reading a complete guide to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland.
Oh, that's fun.
So like once a year, I try to give serious time in my reading to poetry. So last year around this time, I spent like 3 weeks reading The Age of Anxiety by W.H. Auden and then some commentaries on it. And the reason I picked that one is because I love the author Alan Jacobs. And I hope he hears someday that I like him and he writes me a letter. But he did a critical edition of The Age of Anxiety. And so I picked up his copy. And the poem is nearly inscrutable, but I enjoyed the experience of trying to wrestle with it. And so I've decided that this year it's going to be The Wasteland. And so I'm about 40 pages into this little guide that's really, really well written. I think it's a Cornell guide. And it's just talking about the history of the poem, but then also the themes of it and just trying to give someone like me a way to get into a poem that many people have said doesn't really have a point. You know, that's some people have critiqued it that way, but others have said it's magisterial. So I'm reading this guide and then I'll try to get into the poem.
I will make the point that Memoria College has had several classes on Eliot poems that people can check out.
There you go.
I feel like that's such an obscure choice. How did you choose?
It's because of my appreciation for Alan Jacobs. He's an author. His scholarship has been in Lewis, Eliot, and Auden. And they're all kind of, and so in his book, The Pleasures of Reading, The Age of Distraction, he argues that you should try to read upstream and downstream from authors. And I've kind of done that with him. So he wrote about Lewis and Auden and Eliot. And so I've kind of gone back to them because I enjoyed him so much.
But he didn't write the guide that you're using.
Not this one for Eliot,
I see.
that's right.
But he's the one that pointed
kind
you
of
in that
inspired
direction.
me to go that direction, yeah. So the article that we're going to discuss today is written by the one and only Martin Cothran. And Martin, I want to ask you, what caused you, or what inspired you to write this particular article? Were you wrestling with some of the kind of apologetic questions that are in the back end, or is this just an idea that you love? What caused you to put pen to paper with this one?
I don't know if I can really even answer that question. I think I've wanted to write something specifically on this for a while. This idea of Christ as the ultimate hero, to which all others are sort of imitations in some way. And, I mentioned in here Joseph Campbell's idea of the monomyth and how that's been used to subordinate Christ as just another hero that is part of this drama of the monomyth. And I've heard this argument articulated. Lewis sort of makes it. Tolkien makes it. Chesterton was the first to make it, and so I just wanted to put it all in one place. I had a lot of thoughts on this, and as you mentioned, I've had other articles that have sort of dealt with a related issue, but I wanted to just put it down in one statement. The whole argument of Christ as the ultimate hero, and everything else really is the imitation.
Yeah. Now, Tanya, the first sentence has an allusion to George Lucas's The Star Wars. Have you seen this movie?
I have. In fact, I'm old enough that I saw the original. And then I took my children to see it, which was a bizarre moment. And it was brand new to them. But to me, it was like, okay, I'm paying money again to see a movie that came out 20 years ago.
Wait. Was this, so you were watching the same movies that came out in the 70s again with your kids, or were you watching the...
No, it was the exact same movie.
They
re-released it.
Oh,
when the other ones were coming out.
I thought you might have been talking about the prequels that came out.
Oh, no. This was the original. It was the first time. It was interesting because when Star Wars, the original, came out, I think, were we in college? We're college age, maybe? Dave and I
were.
were.
1977, I believe.
Okay, so.
And that was the year I graduated from high school.
Okay, and me too. So no, maybe. I don't remember.
Because I remember.
I think you and I are the same age.
We somehow, because, in one sense, we think back of it and it was a surprise movie because it came out and it had all this.
The
for
special
some reason,
effects.
when we went to see it, which was like the first week it came out, everybody knew about it. I grew up in Southern California. So about 7 of my buddies, we all get together. We drive down to Westwood, California, the UCLA campus, because this big theater there. So we all got into the row about the 10th row, and we got in, and we all just sat there and closed our eyes and waited for the movie to start. When the movie started, we all. And then a friend of mine goes in the restroom, and Lou Ferrigno, who was the Incredible Hulk on TV, is in the bathroom. It's an incredible time.
Wow!
And so. I remember
he has a more detailed memory of this movie than I do. The thing that blew me away was that scene where he's in the tunnel toward the end, I think, where he's in the tunnel. And there has never been anything like that in a movie before that. I mean, now it's just like nothing. But at that point, that was huge that you could do that kind of thing and actually feel like you were in that.
And that guy's saying, steady.
You have to be old to really appreciate what
because now all that special effects stuff
it's just every day.
It's just everyday stuff.
Now, Paul, when you saw Star Wars: A New Hope, were you unimpressed because it's too derivative from Akira Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress that it was based on?
I actually, since you're asking my impression, well, my mother was not big on letting us watch television. And I remember always, like, I would end up at a friend's house and I would catch like 5 minutes of Star Wars. I thought it was the dumbest thing ever. And I would have probably followed in Tanya's footsteps, except I had a buddy who was like, okay, we need to fix you. And he invited me over to sleep at his house that one night. And in one night we watched the 3 original episodes. And he explained it all to me, and I was like, "Oh, this is fascinating. This is wonderful." I mean, at that age, I wasn't putting anything together. But by the time the Phantom Menace came out, I remember going and watching that in theaters, and that's where all of this, the sort of the classical storyline became very apparent to me. Because as a kid, I mean, I'm not thinking like you're not thinking about who Darth Vader is,
right?
But then when you see the conversation of Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn with Anakin's mother, and she's like, I just got pregnant. Like it wasn't a thing, and then you're like, oh, this sounds very much like what I know from the Bible. And that's when I started going, that's when my mother got really turned off by it because she thought that they were trying to twist the gospel.
Yeah. So I think that's why I ask you about Star Wars, is because I want to hear, Martin, you as well connect why that opening illustration was helpful for clarifying your point. But before we do that, let's take a quick break.
Do you need to customize your curriculum for the year, but don't want to juggle all the separate lesson plans? Memoria Press has you covered. Introducing the digital Customized Curriculum Manual. Like our standard printed curriculum manuals that you know and love, the digital Customized Curriculum Manual contains all the same comprehensive teaching guidelines, complete lesson plans, and appendix materials, but tailored to the needs of your students, and for the same price. You can purchase a standalone customized manual and build it from scratch yourself, or you can buy it as part of a customizable curriculum package, which will automatically import all the subject changes you make in your package. No matter how you purchase, you can always navigate to My Curriculum Manuals on your account at memoriapress.com. to download your customized curriculum manual and get the latest updates to your lesson plans. Visit our website for more information or contact our customer service representatives for any assistance with creating your new manual. Memoria Press. Classical, Christian, complete.
Martin, you use Star Wars as an example of the monomyth. Why is it a good example of the kind of story or plot that you're setting up for your article?
I think for two reasons. One is everybody knows it, as we just demonstrated.
Sure.
And the second is because it was the first time I was reading an article about Star Wars, and I think it was this is many years ago, like in USA Today or something, where Lucas talks about this. He talks about reading Campbell and these people and how all his characters, parts of the plot line, all these things were really taken from old stories. And it just, I was really fascinated by the whole concept of the fact that modern stories could just be pieces and parts reassembled from older stories, that it's all there. That idea just fascinates me.
Johnny, when it comes to the monomyth, what Martin is talking about, could you kind of describe that in layman's terms, perhaps? What does Martin mean by this hero's journey, the story that Joseph Campbell talked about?
Well, I only know that based on reading Martin's article.
That's all you need to know.
I've never heard of monomyth before. Had you heard of it before?
I hadn't heard of that expression, but it makes...
It does make sense,
sense.
that everything
Did he
came
invent
from... Did you invent that? You didn't, did you? Did Joseph Campbell?
I'll go ahead and take credit for it.
Did Joseph Campbell use that term?
Yeah.
Monomyth?
No, yeah. Well,
Well, then please don't take credit for it.
I'm not sure he did, but this is very common in the literature, 20th century literature.
Okay. Well, I guess I'm a bit confused because I feel like you're trying to compare Darth Vader to Jesus.
Well,
and I'm not getting that
you
at
were
all.
looking at Paul, right? Not me.
Well,
I'm just not. I get a little bit of that, but I guess it's not a perfect.
You do, but that's the thing is, like, I think the
your
whole
mother
point
would
here,
not be happy that you're comparing Darth Vader to
No.
Jesus.
that Lucasfilm made it very apparent with a virgin birth, right?
Okay.
So Anakin, has no father.
I don't think I recognize that because wasn't she married to somebody?
No,
No.
I
no.
remember
In episode
what Paul's
one-
She was
referring to.
never married.
The one that came out in the early 2000s, the Phantom Menace, that's where it's made very, very clear.
That it was a virgin.
It was a
Okay,
virgin
so
birth.
Immaculate Conception we've got.
And can I make a point here? It's on since Paul's bringing this up. The monomyth can be used in a bunch of different ways.
It doesn't have
And
to
the
be
way
a
in which-
direct.
Right. It's not just a direct Christian parable of some kind at all. And in fact, Lucas's Star Wars is very Taoist. This balance in the force thing. I think of the yin and the yang symbol. They balance each. That's certainly not a Christian idea.
It's a Manichaean sort of.
But it's a myth.
idea.
It's a mythic idea. You do see that in particularly Eastern mythologies. He's even appealing to Eastern mythologies here. So there's not any kind of one-on-one correspondence.
Okay, well, I just got confused when he started talking about the virgin birth and Darth Vader because I couldn't then make the connection with the rest of this
Well, it seems like we're talking about...
Luke actually does a better job of that.
of lining up.
It seems like we're talking about two things that are related, but
Yes.
the relationship between them needs to be clarified.
Yeah.
That
I
is,
think
there's the hero's journey, but then there's also the biblical story. And the biblical story seems to be what lies behind the hero's journey, which I think is the point of Martin's article.
But the only place it's perfected is in the biblical story.
Right. But the hero's journey seems to show up in all stories.
That's right.
Isn't that your point, Martin?
Yeah, that there is this one central story, which he calls the monomyth, which has various different versions and spin-offs, and you see this throughout particularly Western literature and mythology. And so at the beginning of the article, that's what I talk about. I talk about these elements of the story that are common to many, if not all, of these stories in some way, and it's different iterations in different stories throughout Western.
Does every story have all of these in it?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay, so I think we need to talk then about. I think what you're asking me is what is a monomyth?
What are these features of the monomyth that he lays out here that we see in stories?
Right. So he can either tell you or I can read them to you.
Well, instead you should read the article. But I guess I was thinking of like in the Odyssey and the Aeneid, in both stories, Odysseus has a journey into the underworld. He has some kind of death. Aeneas, he goes into the underworld. If you watch John Christensen's video he did on epics, he talks about this Anabasis, this going down that all heroes go in. And then also in both stories, they get well, not in both of those stories. In the Iliad and the Aeneid, in the Iliad, they take a shield, and then the shield of Achilles. And then in the Aeneid, Aeneas takes a shield. These are tokens that they are given, and he didn't mention that here in his article, but many people, when they're describing the hero's journey,
he talks about tokens in point 2.
Yeah, okay.
but mostly paternity.
And Achilles also is a hero that has a god for a father.
Yeah,
yeah, very very common. Yeah. In one way to describe the monomyth is a pattern or a set of patterns that reoccur again and again.
So miraculous birth from a divine parent, an initiation of some kind, which I think that's probably
some
true,
people,
really true.
Yeah, and some people talk about like a guide or a mentor. So in the Odyssey you have mentor. In Star Wars you have Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah, right.
So there's a lot of times the initiation involves some kind of mentor.
The hero withdrawing from the world and preparing for greatness is.
That's where Anakin goes wrong.
Christ goes into the.
That's where Anakin goes wrong by withdrawing from the world.
He did not actually fully withdraw from the world.
He didn't withdraw from the world. He should. That's your spiritual moment. That's when you go to a monastery
for a week
or sit on a hill. Yeah. Yes.
Or a few years.
The Rocky montage when he's running through the streets.
Or a few years. Yes. Rocky.
No, that's really true. That's the point of this. Is that
Sylvester Stallone.
It's universal in stories. Stories, heroic stories,
and a trial or
operate
quest
in any other way than as some assemblage of these patterns.
Right.
If you don't have a trial or quest, you really don't have a story.
Right.
And then some sort of death. Oh, then going to the underworld, which you've already talked about, and then coming back from that. And the example you give is Gandalf in the Fellowship of the Ring, which I don't remember. The Three Hunters. Oh, the Three Hunters. Oh, I know. That's what's his name?
Just
the Aragorn.
Yes, very good.
Aragorn. And
I'm so excited about this that she could actually bring up Lord of the Rings trivia here.
This is great.
Aragorn.
Our audience may not learn anything from this episode.
Who was
but
with
she will.
him? Starts with a P. Little Hobbit.
No, not when they met Gandalf the White.
Okay, who are the other two?
It's the dwarf and the elf.
Oh, Gimli and Legolas.
Yes.
Well, so, and I think that, and Tolkien, I think, is key here because he has this insight, the same insight that's really the subject of this article, and he instantiates it in the story of the Lord of the Rings. I think, in the Lord of the Rings is really, I think, intentionally a Christian story. You have all these other secular versions of this, but then Tolkien comes up with the great modern example of the Christian monomyth. So I think
So
really,
for him, is it Aragorn?
Well, no, that's the beauty of Tolkien is that it's not a 1-to-1. You can see this one character going through all of these things, but that a lot of the characters, right? So you've got Frodo, you've got
Sam.
Gandalf, you've got Sam, you've got a bunch of Aragorn. They're all having different they show these different elements at different times.
Yeah, I mean, Frodo is carrying. He's the ring bearer. He's carrying this thing that throughout the story. He's suffering for the carrying of this thing. It's almost like the burden of sin or something.
And kind of going into Mordor is like the death, and then
you
coming
have
back
Aragorn, who is the prince in exile. He hasn't come back yet,
Right.
And then you have Gandalf, who is also kind of, I think, the third great Christ figure in the story. He
And
fights
he does
with the
go to the
Balrog.
underworld.
The descent into hell from the Apostles' Creed is sort of, I think, demonstrated in that story too. So I think I think he's doing it very consciously.
I was going to say, do you think Tolkien actually had all this complicated stuff in his head when he created these characters? I think that just would take brilliance to do.
Yeah.
I think one of the marks of a great skilled storyteller is the ways that they can weave the hero's journey into their story without it being a one-for-one.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a formula. It's just these
Right.
are how you tell great stories, is weaving it in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, Martin, you move from kind of describing what the monomyth is to then relating it to Christianity specifically and a particular objection to Christianity. The objection is that Christianity, it so resembles all of these other ancient religions and mythologies that it must be just one other ancient mythology or religion. But you say that actually the resemblance is part of what helps us to know that it's actually true. Could you tease that out?
Well, yeah. So the argument of this article is that Christianity is the central pattern, and all these other things are rearrangements of the pattern or taking parts of it, and this sort of thing. And what's interesting to me about Chesterton here, who I bring in, who was so influential on Tolkien and Lewis, and I think he may be where Tolkien got his understanding of this, because I don't see any other writer making this observation because what Tolkien does is he takes that argument that we've got all these things that we've talked about, all these patterns and parts of patterns that we see through all these stories. And so what Joseph Campbell believed, what a lot of these people who study myth have long believed, is that Christianity is just another monomyth, another
one
example of the monomyth.
reason is because some of these other stories come before Christianity. I think that's what the point then that Chesterton's making is, I mean, it's easy to say, well, this story was already here. So then Christians just made up another story that fits what they wanted to believe.
That complicates that sort of seems on first sight to bolster the point of those who believe that Christianity is just another monomyth, is that some of these came before Christianity.
Right.
So the fact that you have these stories that are not only historically universal, they occur in before and after the Christian story, and you have them appearing in cultures all over the world that never had any contact with each other. That's the point. That's the main point. And you can use that to argue that Christianity is just another monomyth. But what Chesterton, I think, as far as I can tell, is the first to do is to turn that on its head. Turn that, because that's a fairly modern observation, right? In the modern period where we're arguing that Christianity is just another monomyth. Chesterton comes in and says, no, wait a minute. Wouldn't it make more sense if you looked at these things to say that Christianity is not another instantiation of the monomyth, but that all of these other stories, that Christianity is itself the central monomyth, and that if that had really happened, if the gospel story had really happened, if including the whole Old Testament, New Testament, if all that had really happened, then wouldn't we expect all of these imitations of it? If it was the thing toward which all things were going, that there was going to be born a God in human flesh, wouldn't you expect that you would see this in other stories as men thought deeply about history?
That it would be just part of our imagination anyway.
That we're born into the world with this built into us, with so that when we see it in our lives, it's like, yeah, that seems to fit reality in some fundamental way, that we're born to perceive that this monomyth has already been there. So Chesterton comes in and he just completely turns the argument around on Robert Blatchford, who was a famous newspaperman in the early 20th century in England, and who had invited all of these people to challenge him on the issue of the truth of religion and his own atheism. And Chesterton came in there and basically makes this point, that Blatchford points out that there's many myths parallel to the Christian story, that there were pagan Christs and Red Indian incarnations and Patagonian crucifixions. But does not Mr. Blatchford see the other side of the fact? If the Christian God really made the human race, would not the human race tend to rumors and perversions of the Christian God? If the center of our life is a certain fact, would not people far from the center have a muddled version of that fact? If we're so made that a son of God must deliver us, is it odd that Patagonians should dream of a son of God? I mean, I just think that's a brilliant insight. And I think it's what Tolkien takes in his essay on fairy stories in the volume Essays presented to Charles Williams that included essays from a number of the Inklings. And this is the argument that brought C.S. Lewis to Christianity. I mean, that's how important this is.
Paul, can you help us clarify the relationship between the hero's journey that appears in the beginning of the article and the apologetic argument that Martin just made? What does the hero's journey, how does that help us to see that the Christian story is the central story?
Well, I mean, if you... honestly, I had no idea where Martin was going with this article when I started reading it. And every time I read one of Martin's articles, I like to pick them apart, see what flaw I can find in them. And as I was going through his 5 points of the hero's journey, I was like, well, he better address that this sounds really darn close to Christianity if he doesn't, right? And so thankfully that was what the whole article was about. I was like, dang it, I can't poke that hole in his argument. But if there's this idea that there's a common hero's journey, right? And then as Christians, we would want to say that as the title of the article is, the culmination of the classical hero. Like, there's if there's a common sort of pattern, then there's probably a prototype, right? Or there's a perfection of this, right? And it's sort of a Platonic ideal. And that's where I think, the argument is a fairly easy one to make. And I don't think the early Christians never had an issue with it, right? The early Christians were well versed in pagan beliefs, right? You couldn't live in that society and not know these stories. And so it would have been, it was very easy for them to say, not only was there revelation in the Hebrew culture that this was coming, right? Not only was there this expectation of a Messiah, but that in the Roman and Greek cultures, there were people longing for this. And we have the answer to it. In the same way that Paul goes to the pagans and says, you've got this altar to the unknown God. You know that you're missing something, but you're longing for it. And that the storytelling they did in their own culture was preparing them for it.
And if we could just look at Greek mythology, which, some people struggle with because it does seem to be the opposite of what we teach in Christianity. But it really, if you could just look at it as the fact that God had not made himself known to those people, but it doesn't mean that he wasn't already infused in them and they were just looking for explanations that they felt they needed. They knew something was missing.
Yeah, that human nature fits this pattern. So when you see something that matches that, you're automatically drawn to it. And I think this is what you just said, I think is really important because it is hard to give an apologetic to a lot of people about why read the Greek myths. I think this is the apologetic right here.
Well, and I mean, it's funny because I remember learning out of Delaire's Greek myths, the story of Deucalion and the flood. Deucalion, whatever.
Yeah, I know.
And it never occurred to me as a child that could be used to undermine the legitimacy of the Bible. To me, it was, well, then evidently the flood happened, right? Whereas, maybe Campbell would take it and say, well, it didn't actually happen. It was just a shared myth that everybody
Right.
had. But it for me,
As a person of faith,
I never
being brought
questioned the
up as a
flood, yeah.
person of faith.
Yeah, and I don't mention the flood in here. But that's another one. That myth is common to cultures all over the world. Why is that? And to say that's just a myth, well, then why does everybody have the same?
There had to have been a flood at some point.
Yeah, is there? Yeah. There's something common that something caused this. What is it?
So I think this maybe would be one area of pushback, and maybe you would agree, and it's just not as clear in your article that you seem to be focusing in very specifically on the hero's journey. But I read a book, I think by an author named Thomas Foster, How to Read Literature Like a Professor. I don't know if you've heard of this.
Yeah, from most of the professors I've known, I don't really want to know how to read like them, but I understand that's a popular book.
His argument is he goes through various kinds of scenes that are thematic in literature, like eating at a table, or when it starts raining outside, or things like that.
Kind of like common universal human experiences?
Well, where in great literature, often it's over the table where people come together for the first time and they share, that's usually a place of unity, just like in the scripture. But also in a lot of great literature, when it's raining outside, usually bad things happen. These kind of common themes pop up all the time in literature, similar to the hero's journey. And at the very end of the book, he kind of lands on two possibilities. Either one, there is some great story that has all of these elements, or it's particular to human people, that there is meaning in these symbols and it's God-given. Or on the other hand, somebody at the very beginning told a story like this and we're all just copying that person, or, we're copying. So it seems like more than just the hero's journey, there are many things that are particular to the human imagination that God put in us. And that's why the stories we tell have certain themes. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily inconsistent. I think both can be true.
Yeah.
And I I think that, one of the other things about this is that when you look at Christianity, I mean, you see, in Christian theology, you see you see this all very highly developed, all of these elements together in this very sophisticated whole that you see in Christian theology. And I think what strengthens Chesterton's argument is, and what makes it not just an alternate theory, is the way he sort of presents it at Blatchford, all these really arguing for it, is that there's no other system of sort of mythical system that matches it in sophistication. I mean, you had all these gods and you had, all of these other elements of this pattern, but never worked together in the way that Christianity has presents itself. So.
You end the article on this concept of you catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
Will you explain that word? And
it's one of those things, even reading Tolkien, I don't completely understand, but he says, it is the bad ending suddenly turned into the good ending. So I assume what he's referring to here is, and then he refers to the Christian You Catastrophe, which is Christ is crucified. He's executed. Okay. It's over, but it's not over. You then, that is the thing that is required to have the greatest thing of all, which is the resurrection. I think that's what he's referring to, the Christian You Catastrophe. He's saying that thing of having a bad ending and then having some good come out of that is common in these stories. But the Christian You Catastrophe is the crucifixion and the resurrection, the good thing coming out of what appeared to be the defeat, the victory coming out of the defeat.
Paul, any other insights on you catastrophe? How does that word land in you, and what do you think of that concept?
Well, what I was thinking of is actually the fall in Genesis, and in the Catholic liturgy at Easter Vigil, there's the name's escaping me right now, but basically a song that's chanted or said or something that says, "Oh, happy fall that won for us so great a Savior," right? This idea that there's that Adam and Eve brought sin into the world, but that fault brought about something greater, right? So when there's something bad that happens, that God is able to turn that around and use that for His glory is something that that Christianity, I think, sort of has a monopoly on, in a way that I don't know, this may be a half-baked thought, but I went back to Star Wars and thought, it's I can't really come up with any good examples of You Catastrophe there. I mean, maybe you could say Darth Vader killing Obi-Wan and Obi-Wan then leading Luke, but it does not have nearly the same pull that a God becoming man, dying, and in that death conquering death for us all, I think has. They're all cheap imitations.
And the interesting thing about this is it has this fundamental, when you read that story of Christ's life and His death and His resurrection, there's some pull to that. It's something that does match something inside of us, and yet we never could have made it up. You know what I'm saying? This is a weird,
or it would have always seemed so impossible, right? It would have seemed like, well, this is a story we tell ourselves, but there's nothing to it, and it would have felt cheap. But because we know that there is actually one time that it happened, and that redeemed us, that we have.
Yeah, and we're so inured to it. We it's so common to us. It doesn't seem to many of us living in the modern West as being all that spectacular. And Chesterton makes this remark in The Everlasting Man. He says, if Christianity could just be pass itself off as, and he's speaking in a pretty secular, because England is pretty secular by the time, Europe pretty secular by the time he's writing. He said, if Christianity could be passed off as a brand new religion from the East, it would sweep everything before it. And we're so familiar with it, and then yet, if you go back and you look at it maybe from this perspective, you realize how amazing it really is.
Yeah, it's a great article, and I would recommend that anybody read it. And on that point, I want to end, Tanya, with this. Have you realized how Martin weaponizes his lack of memory? In that, if he made up the term monomyth, we obviously would have thrown it out right away. But because we don't know if it's from someone legitimate or not, it's in the article. So he's kind of weaponized his...
Well, the whole thing is weaponized. I mean, you asked him at the very beginning why he wrote this article. Well, he's the editor of the Classical Teacher, and he decided that we needed to do...
Put one of his articles in?
Well, no, he always decides that. He decided that we needed to do one on heroes. And so then he immediately says, oh, I have an article on that. It's all our themes are whatever's on Martin Cothran's mind. That's where this comes from. Whatever's on his mind, whatever he wants to write about, that becomes the theme of the catalog. And then we have to build everything else around it. So basically...
I'll have to say that's very well stated.
Yes, thank you.
Well, it was a good theme. It was a good discussion. Thank you, guys. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classical Etc. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider liking this video. If you want to join the conversation, then you can comment below. And if you want to stay connected, please subscribe to our channel. I hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll see you next time.